Good morning and welcome. I think we have a especially fine program for you today, and as you know, it is going to largely revolve around the recent publication of Akbar Ahmed, the Thistle and the Drone. But we expect it's going to be more than a book launch. There have been several other book launches, but that we will have here, I hope, what will be a serious discussion of the book and an opportunity for Akbar, of course, to comment at length about the themes of the book. And we have two discussants as well. But let me first introduce our three participants. Akbar Ahmed, as most of you know, is Ibn Khaldun Professor of Islamic Studies at American University. But if you've just glanced at the biography, you know that he is so much more. In fact, it's hard to believe that there are so many careers wrapped up into one person. I first met Akbar, some 30 years ago when he was a political agent in Waziristan. Well, he was then part of the Pakistan civil service and held posts elsewhere in the civil service. Went on from there about that time to write a very important book about the tribal areas, which I believe came out around 1983. Does that sound right? And so known in the academic community for his fine work as an anthropologist, having been educated at SOAS and Cambridge University. Well, that was only the start of, as I say, what was going to be a very, very varied career. He has been a diplomat, High Commissioner in Britain for Pakistan. He has been a film producer and writer. He's been a playwright. Advisor to policymakers in this country and elsewhere. A media figure that you've undoubtedly seen any number of times. So I think that we're very fortunate to have him here, and I could go on because there is more as well. But you do have a biography with you, and we have two discussants. Peter Bergen, who is known to most of you here for his commentary, his media commentary, and his authorship, especially about South Asia, and particularly about international terrorism. And Hamid Khan here, who is with USIP, is a specialist in formal and informal legal systems, particularly with regard to Afghanistan. And has served in Afghanistan with USIP and has had academic positions. Here again, the biography that you have before you, I think, is going to fill in most of those details, but we have an excellent panel. And so let me now turn over the floor to Akbar Ahmed.
Thank you so much, Marv, for your friendship and for moderating the panel. It's such an honor to be here, to be part of this very distinguished panel. I would like to thank the USIP, particularly my friend Moeed Yusuf, who initiated this particular session. Our focus will be on tribal societies, and there's no better way to understand tribal societies than for us to go to those lands and those people where they live. In the words of Atticus Finch, if you want to understand someone, you need to get into his skin, climb into his skin and walk about. So we're going to see a poem, a video poem called At the Khyber Pass, about the Khyber Pass, which is that key passage between Central Asia and South Asia, which is where the tribal areas of Pakistan are. Asia, please.
At the Khyber Pass. There's nothing spectacular or even dramatic in the climb or the mountains, but the air is almost tense in its silence, so insolently indifferent to me and my times. Here all is awe and hush. Far beyond the pass, Kabuls and Samarkands, all that the urban imagination conjures in nostalgia, the mainsprings of conquest that flooded the fat lands this side of the pass, Delhi and Agra, the irresistible lakes of journey's end. The ear strains to hear, and almost does, the distant din of battle, the clang and clamour of men at war, steel ringing on steel, cries of death and victory, of hooves galloping hard from war for the secret treasures of the Ganges. Kingdoms rising as swiftly as the stroke of a scimitar and vanishing as swiftly. These putty-coloured mountains seem to suggest with supreme indolence, you who would stride and strut and swear, look on us and wonder. They say there was an empire once, and that recently, on which the sun never set. Today, its legacy is a toy train, some cement blocks in tidy heaps to stop German tanks, if you please, and some insignia and escutcheons scratched like military badges on the shoulders of wayside rocks. Fading and exotic memories of Gurkha and Sikh, plump, open-mouthed lizards sitting so still they could be part of the regimental emblem. Like wind they came, like water they left. The thousands of soldiers, the thousands of years, passages long gone, long forgotten in this catacomb of desire and history. Afridi and Shinwari, and before them old Tatara, watch from eagle eyes. O conqueror, gaze on these and wonder. O traveller, be warned and step softly. The hills seem to know, and the air whispers, this evanescent journey, this mad rush will continue, will remain as desperate and as passionate as of yore. But to this end we must come. Silence beyond and silence behind. To this end, teasing imagination leads us and leaves us.
Thank you. Thank you, Asia. Could we have the lights back, please? My main point today will be to emphasize that while the war on terror, the debate about the drone and so on, focuses on security, terrorism, killing, capturing, decapitating, torturing, all kinds of things related directly to action in the field, the analysis points to a missing dimension. And that missing dimension is the community, the tribal community, the society, the women, particularly the women who are very often the victims of the violence, and the cultural and historical context of these societies. That is missing. we don't hear the ordinary people of Waziristan, the people who are caught up in this violence. We don't see them on CNN or on Fox. So therefore, the importance of joining the two parts of the discussion, without which understanding will remain incomplete. The argument is based, as Marvin has pointed out, in my recently published book, The Thistle and the Drone. It's the third part of a trilogy examining relations between the US and the Muslim world. And in this, I have been helped by a magnificent team of young American scholars. Some of them are here this morning. The title contains two metaphors, which are not difficult to locate. The drone symbolizes the age of globalization. The thistle comes from Tolstoy's famous novella Haji Murad. Tolstoy is up in the Caucasus Mountains with the Imperial Russian army, and he notices how much like a thistle these Muslim tribesmen are. And this parallel between a tribal society, between the Scots, who see the thistle as their symbol, and the comparison of Pakhtuns or Yemenis or Somalis with the Scots runs through a lot of the literature of the 19th and 20th century. To me, as an anthropologist, these are societies that could be categorized as segmentary lineage systems. The Pakhtun, the Somali, the Yemeni, the Kurds, and so on. It is also important to understand what is happening in those societies in the context of, and here's another missing dimension, the relationship between the center and the periphery. Now, this is not a new or startling revolutionary theory. The center-periphery discussion, as Marvin will tell you, is standard social sciences literature. We grew up on it. But it somehow has not been really used very much in the discussion on the war on terror in Afghanistan and Pakistan. And yet, to my mind, as a former administrator representing the center in the periphery, I have realized this importance of the central government and its representatives on the ground in understanding or promoting stability or peace or otherwise. For the project itself, I relied on 40 case studies of tribal societies, which stretched from Morocco across the world to the Caucasus, to the tribal areas of Pakistan, to Balochistan in Pakistan and beyond. We analyzed the history, the culture, the codes of honor, the relations between center and periphery, and the impact of 9/11 on all these societies. So this is a presentation based in the social sciences. It is not driven by ideology. It is not saying that this country is right, that country is wrong, my party is right, your party is wrong. It is simply saying, here are 40 case studies, and here are the conclusions. So the reader is allowed to draw his or her own conclusions. I do want to point out that much of the analysis is based in terms of my own understanding, both in a practical way. I've been administrator in the tribal areas of Pakistan. My PhD is based in the tribal areas. And as commissioner in Balochistan, I was commissioner of 3 divisions consecutively. The primary job of the political officer is to maintain law and order. And therefore, dealing with the breakdown of law and order, as we are seeing, becomes of primary concern. And this is supported by my own academic interests. Since the 1980s, I have been interested in these societies. In fact, an early book I edited was called From the Atlas to the Indus, The Tribes of Islam. Now, what I tried to do in this study was to build on my experiences a generation ago, the classic anthropological 30 years in which a new generation emerges, to combine that with current interviews, current information, and create the Weberian ideal type, and call it the Waziristan model, to allow us to have something by which to look at other tribal societies. The Waziristan model is based in 3 pillars of authority. Number 1, traditional leadership depending on common ancestry, on territory, often named after the ancestor. So Waziristan, named after Wazir, the ancestor of both the Wazir and the Masood. The upholders of Pukhtunwali, the code, and the implementation of the Jirga. All these are linked to traditional lineage leadership. The second form of leadership comes from the religious leaders who are not necessarily on the lineage charter. Very often they're outsiders. Their role is to act as mediators between clans. The third pillar is the central government, represented by the political officer, the political agent, and the political agent has been described in the literature as half governor and half ambassador, underlining his role both as a diplomat and as an administrator, an executive. After 9/11, each one of these pillars, and this is the thesis in the book, each one of these pillars in traditional tribal society has been either shaken, demolished, or destroyed. This is the core thesis of the book, that if you have a society and you break the foundations and the structure that holds it up, you create a vacuum. The elders have been attacked so that 400 elders in Waziristan and something like 800 in the tribal areas have been killed in the last few years. Religious leaders are killed, mosques are attacked. Mullah Nur Muhammad, the leader of the Wazir, was killed. Very prominent figure. In my time, he was in jail. And the third pillar, the political agent, has been marginalized, emasculated, because the man running the tribal areas is no longer a civilian. He is a military man, the general, the GOC in that area. So you can see in that vacuum, accelerated after 2004 by the invasion of the Pakistan Army, 2004, it's a clear-cut date, the commencement of the drone strikes, you will see the correlation between the emergence of the suicide bomber, the war on terror, and the violence it brings to Waziristan. The tribal rivalries continue. So you are seeing the ordinary Wazir or Masood facing Armageddon, literally. One day a drone strike, the next day a suicide bomber, the third day the Pakistan Army looking for terrorists, and the fourth day tribal rivalries. Ordinary families are going through a very, very difficult period. And therefore, large sections of the population have chosen to escape this mayhem and take shelter in some city in the settled areas as refugees, as destitute refugees. In 2007, the attack on the Red Mosque, in fact, triggers the creation of the TTP, the most virulent of the Taliban formations. And there, an immediate correlation, and we have it in the book, between the actions of the TTP and the Pakistan Army, where there's a counterattack and attack and counterattack. And very often they will say, we are doing this as revenge for this particular action. So once again, the notion of revenge, the code, both in the army and the TTP is evident. After more than a decade, after more than trillions of dollars, thousands of lives lost, we ask ourselves, where are we in these areas? Well, the answer is a grim one. Suicide bombings happening right now. Last week we saw Tira, the Pakistan Army, involved in a skirmish with the TTP, where 30 elite soldiers of the Pakistan Army, the commandos, the equivalent of the SEALs, were actually killed. And so far it's estimated, and here I'm borrowing from my friend Peter Bergen, something like 3,000, 3,500 people killed in Waziristan alone as a result of the drone strikes. Across the border in Afghanistan, we know the continuing deaths of American soldiers, of the killings of civilians, the collateral damage, the new phenomena of the green on blue killing, where American soldiers are then target of their own colleagues, and the disturbing, and I find this extremely disturbing, development of suicide among soldiers. And many of my own students have gone on to join the army, and the idea that a soldier so motivated, so enthusiastic to defend and fight for his country or her country is prepared to take their own life means that something is going horribly wrong in their lives. And we need to be thinking about it seriously in order to prevent it happening. If this is not working, if this paradigm is not working, we need to stop and sit back and say, how do we fix it? What can we do to make sure that we have a paradigm that is more suitable to this particular situation? We need to understand that these are impoverished areas. I want to underline this fact. When I was in these areas a generation ago, there was virtually no sign of colleges, hospitals, main highways, electricity. And today I understand not much has changed. And yet, these people, I know, I'm in touch with them, are desperate for good education, for stability in their lives, for progress, for the capacity to be able to live like other citizens of the country. I would argue that it is critical for the leaders of Pakistan, the leaders of Afghanistan, the leaders of the United States, particularly those whose job it is to think about these issues, to step back and ask questions. And ask questions with some compassion, a word that doesn't seem to exist anymore in this war on terror, with some humility, another word that seems to have disappeared over the last decade, and really begin to ask, is this how we are helping the people we are meant to help? The central government in Pakistan, the central government in Kabul particularly, needs to ask these questions to show wisdom and to show vision. Because the problems in Waziristan are not the problems of Afghanistan or the United States. They are the problems of Pakistan. And in order to tackle Waziristan or the other tribal areas, Pakistan needs to show a great deal more wisdom and vision than it is showing at the moment. It needs to create, or I would say recreate, begin to recreate in a very slow, systematic, structured way, some of the core elements of the Waziristan model, adapted and adjusted. For example, the treatment of women, women's rights, democracy itself, development schemes, educational schemes, the importance of honest and just civil servants to help administer those areas. And these solutions are long-term by definition and holistic in nature. The reaction so far is too often patchwork. It comes and goes. I notice we are following this in great detail. There are peace treaties. The tribal leaders are brought to Islamabad or Peshawar. They are honored. And next day, something breaks down, and once again, the battle starts. Strategically, I would want the thinkers of Pakistan, the thinkers in Washington, remember these are allies. Pakistan is a major non-NATO ally, so these are allies in a common battle against a common foe, which is terrorism. It's in their interest to contain and control and eliminate terrorism. They need to remember that even the British, the colonial British at the height of their power, did not indulge in the folly of taking on the toughest tribes in Balochistan, the Mari and the Bukti, and the toughest tribes in the tribal areas of Pakistan, the Masood and the Wazir. Well, Pakistan has taken them on simultaneously. The problems in the Mari and Bukti area, starting from the time that Nawab Bukti was killed in Balochistan, and that's a simmering situation, fraught with dangers. Too few Pakistanis are aware of that or have been able to come up with any solution. As if this was not enough for the plate in Pakistan, another front, another tribe has been involved, and that is the Afridis in Tira. And that is again an area, if you read your history, where even the British, at the height of their powers, only once penetrated it with the army and marched right through it. They did not pause. They went right through it and went to the other side and came out. So again, the need to sit back, pause, and come up with long-term solutions, strategies based in the idea that they are dealing with entire societies. There are some terrorists among them, some criminals, some bad guys. They must be dealt with. But the entire society cannot be condemned in this broad brush manner and allowed to suffer as they have suffered for this length of time. Because the killings, by definition, will create more killings. That is human nature. That is the rhythm of history in that part of the world. And someone who has dedicated his life to promoting understanding between the US, the West, and the Muslim world, what saddens me is that the drone and the debate about the drone, which is so different here in the United States and over there in Pakistan, that debate and the virulence around it and the reaction in Pakistan, the anger and the hatred about the drone and the issue of the drone, has drowned out what for me is of permanent value in terms of the United States and what it can give to countries like Pakistan. The vision of the founding fathers, the vision of societies based in democracy, human rights, civil liberties, respect for knowledge, the idea of justice, the idea of civility. It's well worth remembering that the only book that Washington wrote had the word civility in its title. Those are the values that people in Afghanistan and Pakistan value, identify with, and respect. And those values have been blurred and lost in this present episode in history. This is something I would want all experts to ponder and consider. We need to constantly remind Pakistan of its own founding father, Muhammad Ali Jinnah, who constantly advocated and fought for a pluralist, modern democracy for his country. Women's rights, minority rights, education, the law. And we need to remind ourselves here in the United States of the moral courage and vision of our own founding fathers, Washington, Jefferson, and Franklin. And we need to appreciate that their ideas are in danger of being lost in this very thick fog that hangs over the war on terror as it involves tribal societies, in this case, Waziristan. Thank you.
Thank you. Peter?
Thank you for the invitation, and thank you to Ambassador Ahmed for their book, and thank you, Marvin, for hosting the panel. So I wanted to pick up on the drone issue. Obviously, according to a recent poll, only 17% of Pakistanis have a favorable view of the drone program. That number, in fact, seems high to me. Of course, in the United States, as Ambassador Ahmed indicated, the drone program is quite popular. I think the last time I saw a poll, it was around 65% popularity. I think the drone program has changed quite significantly in ways that isn't necessarily completely appreciated or understood in Pakistan. And let me just sort of give you some data to support that. You know, in 2010, there were 122 drone strikes. Last year, there were 48 drone strikes in Pakistan. At the same time, there was, in 2010, there was one drone strike in Yemen, and there was 46 in Yemen last year. So the drone program in Pakistan has gone down very dramatically in terms of the number of targets. Meanwhile, the drone program in Yemen has gone up rather dramatically. Now, in Yemen, popular opposition to the drone program, I think, is hard to judge. There hasn't really been polling on this question in Yemen. There have been some demonstrations in Yemen, quite small compared to the demonstrations we've seen in Pakistan. And in September, President Hadi, the new president of Yemen, came to United Nations General Assembly and said publicly, and this is a first at the UN, that he embraced the drone program, he approved of it, and he actually said, I approve every single drone strike. I think that's a little unlikely. He then also gave an interview to the Washington Post saying that drones have better brains than humans, or so I'm paraphrasing. So the point is that in Yemen, there seems to be a different kind of political environment than there is in Pakistan, at the same time that the Yemeni drone program has gone up dramatically and the one in Pakistan has gone down dramatically. Now, that isn't to say, of course, that the drone program in Pakistan has ceased. And since we're on the subject of Waziristan and since we're at USIP, I wanted to give you some headlines from a poll that New America Foundation, where I work with, funded by USIP, in combination with a local NGO called CAMP. We went into the tribal regions and did the first opinion poll, which is not a survey, it's a scientific poll of sensitive political issues. And we particularly asked about the drone program. And one of the reasons that we did this poll is that an organization called Ariana in Peshawar had done a survey. Now, a survey is basically if I asked everybody in this room what their opinion about President Obama is. It's interesting, but it's not particularly useful. An opinion poll is a scientifically weighted, demographically weighted type of enterprise in which you speak to 1,000 people and you get a better sense of what people's real views are. And that's what we did in Fatah. And we found that unlike what Ariana had found, which was a survey, basically anecdotal, and they said that drones were popular in the tribal regions, we found 90% opposition to U.S. military operations in the region in the tribal regions. Interestingly, if the drone program was administered by the Pakistani military, that opposition halved. So it's not the drone program per se, it is the feeling that our national sovereignty is being infringed, which is, I think, the main issue in Pakistan. The drone program is part of a package that includes Raymond Davis, who was a CIA contractor who killed 2 Pakistanis. The drone program is part of a package that includes the Osama bin Laden raid, which was done without giving Pakistan a heads up. The drone program is part of a package that includes the killing of the 724 Pakistani soldiers by an inadvertent NATO airstrike, which took the United States 9 months to apologize for. So it's sort of bound up in this issue of national sovereignty as much as it is anything else, because another part of the criticism of the drone program in Pakistan has been the kind of view that a lot of civilians are being killed by the program, and that is factually not true. That was factually true some time ago, but it's no longer true. If you look at, and we collect, and it's not just the New America Foundation, there's the Bureau of Investigative Journalism, which is hardly a fan of US military operations in London, and also the Long War Journal. And basically, while there are differences in the methodology and some of the conclusions between these 3 organizations, they broadly find the same things, which is the civilian casualty rate has been dropping very precipitously over time, from about 60% under George W. Bush to, we calculate a 2% civilian confirmed and a 9% unknown, which could be civilian or militant, and the rest militants today. These numbers are estimates, they're not precise. But the fact is that for a combination of reasons, we've seen a very sharp fall in the number of civilian casualties. Why is that? I think there are several reasons for that. 1, the intelligence is better. 2, the drones can linger over targets for longer. 3, the payloads are smaller. 4, there's been a declining number of strikes in Pakistan, so of course the number of civilians are also declining. President Obama, when he came into office, I tightened up the rules of engagement. As you know, if there is a high probability of civilian casualties, President Obama himself has to be involved in the decision. And I think another factor that can't be underestimated here is growing public awareness of the program and growing public discussion. And to the Obama administration's credit, there's been more discussion of this program, and I think it's a merited discussion because, for all sorts of reasons. Louis Brandeis, the Supreme Court Justice, said a century ago, sunlight is the best disinfectant, and I think that is definitely true in this case. When there is more public kind of scrutiny, more congressional scrutiny, people are, just but human nature suggests you're going to be more careful. And there was a debate between the State Department and the CIA. Ambassador Cameron Munter, after a particularly deadly strike on March 17th, 2011, the day after Raymond Davis was released, some 30 or so, mostly civilians, it appears, were killed in a drone strike. And this precipitated a debate that was at the White House. in which there was strong words were exchanged between, amongst others, Leon Panetta and Hillary Clinton and others. And basically, the State Department point was, if the prices of a successful drone program is that we're going to anger 180 million Pakistanis, which is going to be the fifth largest country in the world armed with nuclear weapons, that's a pretty large price to pay. And if most of the victims of the drone program are lower-level members of the Taliban, which is simply a factual matter, it has evolved from being a sort of targeted program of killing of al-Qaeda's leaders effectively into a kind of counterinsurgency air force. And we need to think more carefully about how we use the program. And I think CIA still won the war. They still control the ability to do a drone strike. The State Department can lodge a sort of complaint, but because of the time frame, there's not much that can be done. But I think State Department won the larger battle in the sense that you can see that the number of drone strikes have gone down very dramatically in Pakistan. And there might be another reason for that. Of course, in Parliament in April, the Pakistani Parliament voted against this. In the Shamsi Air Force Base in Baluchistan, where a lot of the drones took off, was closed. And we've seen a change in the environment. And that's all to the good. I thought it was interesting that former President Musharraf, said on CNN a few days ago that, yes, his government did authorize these strikes, which is something that we've always sort of known, but it was interesting to get a real confirmation. Ambassador Ahmed asked, how do we fix all this? I think that's a very complicated matter. But I think there are two big political events that are coming out that can change the big picture, or help to change the big picture around this. The May 11th election in Pakistan, I think, cannot be on. I think is a major political event for the most obvious reason being that you will now potentially have a civilian government in charge in Pakistan for a decade if the military doesn't intervene. And I think the fact that the Afghan parliament had a debate about drones, this as far as I can tell, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, because it seems to be the first time that civilian government has actually tried to, or civilian political leadership has tried to intervene in an area of national security in a serious manner. And this is something to be encouraged. Clearly, if you look at the set of cards that India was handed in 1947 and the set of cards that Pakistan was handed in 1947, in theory, Pakistan should be doing a lot better than India. And in fact, of course, it's the other way around. And what is the big difference? It's the constant intervention and defamation of the Pakistani body politic by either military coups or military monopoly of questions that relate to national security. And the other, I think, big opportunity is the election in spring of 2014, which I know is something that in Afghanistan, which I know USIP has spent a lot of time thinking about. And if that election is free and fair enough and uncontested enough, I think Afghanistan is actually set on a trajectory that looks reasonably okay, that it will be a somewhat functional Central Asian country. If, on the other hand, that election is deeply contested and regarded as not being free and unfair, and very unfair, we will see that Pakistan might revert into some form of civil war. Nothing as bad as the mid-90s, but something pretty bad. And of course, that would be terrible for Afghanistan and Fatah, and actually, of course, for Pakistan. And while there are very differing interests of Pakistan and the United States and India and every other country in what happens in Afghanistan, everybody has two common goals. No one wants the Taliban to control Afghanistan, and no one wants another civil war. And these are two big areas, I think, in which we can, since we have so much common agreement, we can build on. And for that reason, I'm actually somebody who's quite optimistic about the future of Afghanistan, and even actually of Pakistan going forward.
Thank you. Ahmed?
Thank you, and thank you for the participation and the ability to speak. As an ethnic Pashtun and as the son of a former Pakistani Army officer, it's always incumbent upon me to talk about the rule of law, which always seems to be a bit fleeting in this type of situation. In the United States, we've had a fairly robust beginning to a discussion about the context of drones, questions about their constitutionality, about questions regarding the oversight of the president and the executive as to the extent to which the executive can seek such authority. But there are also broader questions of international law, international humanitarian law that also need to be addressed. And I think it's safe to say that the question of drones is not certainly going to be limited to Afghanistan or Pakistan. It is likely to be not only the conduct of the US, as has already been seen in Yemen, it will likely expand to North Africa. And then more importantly, the question then arises what other countries will utilize this authority and what precedent the United States will then set in so doing for other countries to then take the lead. When will they seek anticipatory self-defense as a means for them to then take up arms and quash their own insurgencies or those that they label terrorists? So I think that it's important to consider that there are broader ramifications that I think that we in the United States have not fully realized, but now have become and started to become internalized in Pakistan. As somebody who's traveled to the Pashtun areas and Waziristan 6 months ago, the feeling, the sentiment is palpable, and that the anti-American sentiment is something that is measurable, specifically on the context of drones. But as Peter has already pointed out, I think it's safe to say that there is an important narrative to be discussed and that is underlined in all this, which revolves around the question of Pakistani sovereignty. This has been the linchpin of the Pakistani military. It has been the linchpin of perceptions about India. It's Pakistan's rival. It has also been used as justifications for the construction and the tolerance of the Taliban on the other side of the border. So I think that in as much as we would like to discuss this as part of a narrative of Islam versus the United States, which is another important narrative, it also must be considered that these incursions into sovereignty or the perception of those incursions need to be taken at face value. And to the extent that we have statistics available and to the extent that we can measure the numbers of civilians who have died, the numbers vary from 1,500 to 3,500, depending on which account is to be believed. And I've seen varying numbers to that effect. But the perception of impunity and the perception, more importantly, of complicity between Pakistan and the United States not only leads to important questions about the U.S. conduct, but also the complicity of the Pakistani government. Now, as we already know, Pakistan already has a number of challenges, a population that is growing at an immeasurable rate. We have control of the military, but we also have challenges that deal to human development, the consumption of potable water, the lack of widespread electricity. So these become planks, and this becomes an overarching plank in which to justify questions about Pakistani governance. And as the elections approach, there are important questions to be considered about whether or not any duly elected government in Pakistan or the current government of Pakistan can withstand both the human development concerns that plague the country as well as those concerns which are far outside. So it needs to be considered that narrative, the narrative of Pakistan's integrity, its sovereignty, has to be considered even if the numbers are diminishing over time. The other issue, of course, is this broader issue that the ambassador touched upon, which is drone strikes by their nature appear to be weapons of terror. And whether that perception is real, measured, or unlikely for the vast majority of citizens, it is very real. Combined with these drone strikes are also a number of suicide attacks, and the number of civilians who have died in Pakistan as a result. And the broad sense among most Pakistanis that this is day-to-day conduct. But the fever pitch towards the United States and the question about whether this fits in within the larger narrative about a war against Islam, when one considers this narrative in concert with what's going on in Mali, with other Islamic groups, it becomes and feeds a larger extremist ideology. And in so much as the war on terror is aimed at trying to stop or to nullify terror as it exists or Islamic extremists, it's worth considering that this is actually creating the effects that they are trying to avoid. And there are thinkers who are looking at this issue, but it remains to be seen whether those thoughts are having any effect in places like Islamabad or Peshawar. The other issue, of course, is the cross-border instability. And the ambassador has pointed out that there has been a widespread degradation of tribal leadership in Waziristan. But to be fair, the widespread degradation of tribal leadership on the Afghan side has been going on for some time, precipitated by civil war. And one wonders that if there is to be a civil war post-2014, if the elections don't create a bubble of credibility for the Afghan government and the central government, whether that degradation will continue. So it remains to be seen that we're seeing the degradation of tribal leadership in a number of different areas. That adherence to whatever tribal custom may pervade needs to be considered in the long term. Finally, it's also important to consider that we stand at an important crossroads. The latest director of the Central Intelligence Agency has forecasted the end to the war on terror. But it remains to be seen what that actually will happen and whether the continued use of drones will actually cause us to question or whether we actually in an intractable situation. If other nations are using drones for their own purposes or seem to use it, grant license to do so, then one wonders, how can one demarcate an end? When can one declare that one's self-defense has reached a point in which there is no return? And so as I look to the future on some of these issues, we have created a very difficult situation, a precedent established by the Bush administration that has been continued in the Obama administration and arguably intensified. And it harkens back to questions like Guantanamo Bay, which while opened under the Bush administration, remains open under the Obama administration. And while political pressure has been drawn to close that, it has always been the history in American use of executive power that once open and once used, it's often difficult to curtail and to circumvent. Thank you, Martin.
Thank you, Ahmed. In just a moment, I will open up the floor to your questions. I did want to, though, ask of Akbar. In the discussion this morning, we didn't hear anything about Islamic militancy, Deobandi, or cross-national Islamic militancy. For most observers, as they look at both the Talibans, they see a dimension which goes beyond or has replaced, really, much of what we associated with the tribal societies. How does one factor this in? Is that, in fact, all tribal? Or did something happen? Has there been a transformation which has superseded then, to a great extent, the importance of the tribe? I know that you've probably had that question asked of you before, so I just want to give you an opportunity to expand on that.
Thank you, Mark. It's a very important question. In fact, there's a long and detailed discussion in the book, as you can imagine, on precisely this issue, the role of Islam. And as Professor Marvin Weinbaum correctly says, the analysis, by and large, certainly in Washington and very often in countries like Pakistan and Afghanistan, by the experts looking at the issue is within this frame. Now, I'm arguing, again, from the point of view of the ethnic community under study, that it is not so simple, that while by definition every Pashtun is a Muslim and proud to be, as is every Somali, Yemeni, Kurd, by definition they'll say we are Muslim, their understanding of Islam and their sway under the ideological tidal waves that emanate from settled areas is very ambiguous. And perhaps the answer given by one of the most famous sons of the soil from the old frontier province, Walikhan, the son of the frontier Gandhi, Ghaffar Khan, when he was asked about his identity, should tell us something about how these people think in response to your question about Islam. He said, I was a Pashtun several thousand years ago. I've been a Muslim for over 1,000 years. And I've been a Pakistani, and he said this just after the East Pakistan debacle. He said, I've been a Pakistani for 2.5 decades. So here we have a kind of categorization. And he sums up how the problem can be looked at, that in fact, by definition, Pakhtuns are Muslim. So the issue of being a Muslim or a non-Muslim doesn't really arise. At the same time, you do have what you're talking about, militancy. You can label it Islamic militancy, jihadist, Islamicist, whatever. There is militancy. And I have pointed out, and I've in great detail gone into case studies, not only in the tribal areas of Pakistan, but 40 other tribal societies, where there are striking similarities in these three pillars in the context of their histories, that the first target of these militant groups in the tribal areas, the TTP, Al-Shabaab in Somaliland, the Boko Haram in West Africa, the first target is invariably the three pillars of authority. So the Pashtun leaders themselves become the first targets. The religious figure who would normally represent Islam, the mullah, the religious fellow running the madrasa, he's become the target now, because his version of Islam would demand, and that is his role in society, a kind of mediation between the warring parties, a kind of attempt to bring stability to the area. He's become a target. And a new kind of very aggressive militant group emerges. Now, how you deal with this is a problem. As we saw with the Lal Masjid raid by the under President Musharraf. Musharraf gives it a long, long rope, but the writ of the state is being challenged right under his nose in the capital of Pakistan, in Islamabad. And in the end, he sends in the elite army units, and many people are killed, hundreds of people are killed. And many of these kids, students, men, women, are from the tribal areas, from the frontier province. And that immediately triggers revenge attacks. And if you see the graph, the violence shoots up. So it is, I would say, complicated by these strands. And I come back to Peter's point about the statistics of drones. We need to look at the statistics not only in terms of the increasing precision and the less number of civilians being killed, but also the psychological impact it's having in those areas. And again, I want to point out, this is not only the tribal areas of Pakistan, they're also in Afghanistan, also among the Somali, Yemeni, and now in eastern Turkey with the Kurds and the Tausug in the Philippines, and with the Tuareg in Mali. So it is a phenomenon. In the next decade, maybe there'll be thousands more drones with dozens of other countries involved. A nightmare scenario when both India and Pakistan may be sending drones across the borders. Who's going to check that, and where is it going to stop? So all this is in the pipeline. And while by nature I'm optimistic, I think the mathematics, the equations are not particularly optimistic. So we need to keep this in mind, that for these tribes who are the target, the drone has become a dreadful symbol of violence. There is no question about it. And these statistics, I've spent most of my life in these areas, are at best estimates. I'm always very dubious about a lot of these statistics, whether it's population, whether it's even the age of the person you're interviewing. It all depends on how they are going to respond at that moment in time. And there's a difference in how central governments are looking at the drone program. Peter quoted the president of Yemen. He would see it like that. He would see it's a great, great instrument. Why? Go back to the whole thesis of center and periphery. It reinforces his authority. Through the authority of the drone, vicariously, he can show his military superiority over the tribesmen. If you recall President Musharraf's words when he hit Nawab Bukti, he said he will not know what hit him. He's going to use a weapon which the Nawab in Balochistan cannot conceive. And he's just admitted on CNN that, in fact, he very much knew about the drone program. The Prime Minister of Pakistan, in one of the WikiLeaks, admitted that not only did he know about the drone program, but that he apparently told the American ambassador that he would go to Parliament and say how dreadful and these Americans are doing the wrong thing, etc., protest, and then requested the Americans to carry on. So there's not only complicity, there's a certain amount of duplicity here. The government of Pakistan has to realize that these people on the periphery, particularly in Balochistan, tribal areas, comprise geographically about half the country. These are vital areas of Pakistan. These are citizens of Pakistan. And if drones are being used against them, it is national sovereignty that's being breached, and that upsets Pakistanis, feeds into the national narrative now in the politics, and it become a symbol of anti-Americanism. But more than that is involved. When I talk to my American friends, they say, yes, but this is what keeps troops off the boots off the ground and so on, keeps us safe here so that people are being killed over that end. But they don't realize that these drones are hitting at a country that is not at war with the United States. Pakistan is not at war with the United States. So the example of how Germany was attacked or Japan and what weapons were used is not a correct analogy for this particular situation. In terms of what happens next in the future, while optimistic we are on the right path, the process of democracy has begun, and thank God, both the Afghans and the Pakistanis have shown they want democracy. I would again urge some caution, because unless you have some structure in these tribal societies, a structure of leadership, a structure of religious leadership, a structure representing a neutral, just, and honest central government representative, once power is transferred, law and order will not automatically be restored. I can almost guarantee this. You're already seeing the TTP in the old frontier province playing havoc with the elections. They're targeting the so-called secular parties. They've just shot a candidate in Swat. They've shot someone in Peshawar. I'm talking now. They are aware, they know what's at stake, and they're fighting. The answer has to come from within the tribal structures. Otherwise, elections will take place, transfer power, new government in power, and the problems on the ground in those areas will be exactly the same. And we are confronted again with law and order problems, and what do we do about it?
So, Akbar, you're suggesting that it is possible to revive the tribal system. Do I understand you correctly? Because that is, I think, the presumption here, that for all of its degradation, that it is still, these are still structures which can serve the people of the area, and obviously, presumably, also leave less space for the militants.
Yeah, you see, Marvin, what I find is that there has to be a local solution to a local problem. And the solutions are being imposed by the central government, which very often really doesn't understand, and I'm talking as a former administrator, and the Americans, with all their good intentions, who are frankly speaking clueless. So you have two sets of people dealing with these societies and not getting it right. That is why we are where we are. It's been over a decade, for God's sake. This is the longest war in history. We're not dealing with Japan or Germany. We're dealing with the tiny tribal societies. Waziristan is barely 1 million in population, 800,000 or 900,000 people. But if they do not have a structure within society, a structure which was already, as you say, degraded, it was downhill, it was corrupted, it was at best very, very shaky, but it was a structure. Now it is demolished, and there's a vacuum. And in that vacuum, the TTP are dominant, and they are very dominant. They can threaten you, they can kill you, they can kidnap you. What counters them? You'll have to call in the drone. Drone is counterproductive. Or you use the army, and again, everything in that area is ethnic. Ahmed Khan just pointed out his ethnicity. What is the Pakistan Army? Who are the Pakistan Army soldiers? They come largely from the province of Punjab. And when you use a Pakistan Army, I mean, for God's sake, That was the solution in 1971. It did not work. When you use an ethnically outside soldier in that area, you're creating problems for both, because Pakistan Army is still, by and large, with all the ups and downs, still very respected in Pakistan. It is the one institution which has a command and control structure. It is the one institution, by and large, seen as the last barrier, as it were, holding Pakistan and its identity in place, by and large among the public. And yet it is putting incredible pressure on the ordinary soldier, not the generals who sit in Islamabad, the ordinary soldier who has to go into the tribal areas, who thinks like the tribesmen, who says prayers like the tribesmen, who has the same rituals as the tribesmen, and yet is shooting at him, Muslim killing Muslim. He cannot make sense of it. To the point that at one stage, the tribesmen declared that if a Pakistani soldier is killed in the tribal areas, he must not be buried according to Islamic ritual. That is the tension faced within. And there, Marvin, I want to point out the whole thesis of Islam and non-Islam just collapses. These are Muslims fighting Muslims. And it doesn't make sense to either. Therefore, I'm going back. Until you have law and order, until you have a semblance of authority internally, elections and change of governments in Peshawar or Islamabad will have the most limited impact in the tribal areas of Pakistan.
Okay, thank you. So we'll take questions at this point. I have right down here in front of you. Wait for the microphone, and please do introduce yourself.
I'm Lynn Carter. I'm with Management Systems International. So how do you get to that semblance of law and order? You're suggesting it needs to be internally imposed, yet we've heard traditional structures are much eroded, both on the religious and the tribal side. The U.S. government's clueless, the Pakistani government's clueless, the Pakistani military is clueless. How do you reconstruct tribes to fill that vacuum?
Lynn, simple. First of all, start reading my book. It'll give you... I'm serious, it's not a joke. No, but Lynn, let me go back. 1947, Pakistan is created. The tribal areas of Pakistan, the old British India, are now Pakistan's concern. And these areas, I want to remind the audience, were the most turbulent areas on the subcontinent. Waziristan in the mid-1930s destroyed an entire British brigade. High noon of empire, a British brigade disappeared. That is the Masood. The most ferocious Masood and Wazir, tribes of the Pashtun. In the 1930s, the British had more troops in Waziristan, please note the statistic, than on the rest of the subcontinent put together. You're dealing with these peoples. So the British needed, they came up with this brilliant solution, have a political agent, give him all authority. A political agent, for those of you who may jump to conclusions that this is like Raymond Davis, some CIA colleague, in fact is called a political agent because he was agent to the Governor General, that is the Viceroy of India. And his line of authority and communication went directly to the Viceroy. At one point, Lord Curzon, in fact, directly administered Waziristan. So Pakistan now inherits this. What does it do? The founder of Pakistan, Pakistan's Washington and Jefferson, is Mr. Jinnah. And he is not an expert on the tribal areas. He's not like our experts commenting on it today. He's grown up in Bombay and Karachi. He's educated Lincoln's Inn in London, so he really knows very little. But he has a very sound political understanding of his people. And he addresses the people of the tribal areas. And in fact, I've got a quotation from the son of one of the members who attended that jirga, who later became a general in the Pakistan Army. He addresses them and says, "You are my brothers. You are now citizens of a free country. You're not being ruled by foreigners and colonials. As of today, I'm withdrawing the entire army. You are now going to be the guardians of the frontier." Lynn, one brilliant stroke, master stroke. Overnight, he just throws everything upside down. Suddenly, the borders are empty of soldiers. People are horrified. Army advisors tell him, "Sir, this is going to be disastrous. Because if there's an uprising, who's going to control them?" And that worked. That one master stroke did two things. It showed the tribesmen that they are being honored, and they were going to honor Mr. Jinnah in return. And that piece, by and large, again, everything on the frontier is very, very relative, by and large, with little ups and downs and blips, was sustained for the next half century. And today you've got, I don't know how many soldiers, Peter probably knows, Pakistani army, 100,000, 50,000, 150,000. And every day you have suicide bombers, you need drones, you need the army helicopters flying in. You've got then the suicide bombers almost at will, attacking GHQ, attacking the naval headquarters, attacking schools, attacking hospitals. It's a breakdown. And Lynn, as a former political agent in charge of Waziristan, this is absolutely unacceptable. This is a complete breakdown for me. Now, I'm not talking as a theorist, as a scholar, as a writer. I'm talking as a practical man, because if a Wazir or Masood comes to me and says, my family lives in fear, I'm escaping this agency, I failed. I cannot provide them the minimum, which is security and stability. So therefore, this process needs to start with some understanding of that part of the world. It is a special area, and I agree, it's going to be long, and maybe it won't ever succeed, because people are impatient. They don't want long answers. They want quick solutions.
Okay, Hamid, you wanted to comment?
Just to add some additional points, part of the work that we've been doing here at USIP is to examine some of the intersections between customary law in the tribal areas in Afghanistan, which has suffered great degradation as a result of civil war and as a result of some of the same, probably the same causes that the ambassador alludes to in Fanta. But what's interesting to note is that that degradation has not been, there's at least presumably the notion that if we withdraw, that somehow the vacuum would restore itself. But there is to be some consideration for the spoilers. The predominant Salafist influence, Deobandi influence, has still permeated in places like Afghanistan. And the question is, how long will it take? Because one of the important aspects to tribal culture is the repository of knowledge in the elders. But with the death of elders and a larger demographic shift among those who are young is actually creating a tectonic shift demographically in which there isn't a quick replacement of tradition, knowledge, adherence to different laws and tribal customs. And it's also to be keyed into that the social cohesion of tribal structures, at least with respect to Afghanistan, has been upset by the predominance of more fundamentalist strains of Islamic thinking that is more based upon the individual rather than the social cohesion of the family or the larger tribal ethos. So I wonder, and I'm sure the ambassador tackles some of these issues, but the question is, even if you were to withdraw all of these forces, even if there were to be a light hand on many of these issues, there are demographic issues that need to be considered, and the permeation of an ideology that's not easily replaced. At least the evidence that we have done at USIP over the last 9 years in Afghanistan suggests that those are issues that still need to be addressed.
And then I just want to point out that I have given case studies. So again, I'm not talking theory. I'm giving you actual case studies, how these things work out, how you must use force when necessary. Remember, the ultimate aim of the political agent is to maintain the writ of the government. So you use force, and how to use diplomacy, tribal networks, and a combination to get your objectives. The problem is you have customary law. You do not have central government law in the tribal areas. You do not have judges. You do not have the police. And yet you want justice. There was, for centuries, what was called riwaj, customary law. Now that needs to be brought up to date. You need to have some kind of movement into the 21st century. Democracy, rights for women, all this has to happen. And in a situation where there is no structure, who is going to implement this? Therefore, I go back to my point, unless there's hard and fast thinking, we are not even going to take that one tiny step forward. And that is why my appeal, especially to the think tanks, to say enough is enough. we need to do some hard thinking.
We only have about 15 minutes left for questions, so I'm going to ask us all to restrain ourselves. I know that there's just so much to say here, but I'd like to get in as many questioners as possible. Yes?
Hi, my name is Symbol, and I'm the Pakistan Fellow at the Woodrow Wilson Center. Two questions, one to both Hamid and Ambassador Ahmed, and next to Peter. There's a lot of discussion here about the structure of the tribal society, or reintroducing or reinforcing the withered structure of the tribal society. But as we know, I think all structures, all political structures, all ethnic structures are all built into the political economy of the area. I'd like to hear from both of you as to what changes you've seen in the political economies, for example, of FATA. And as we know, it used to be a subsistence, remote area, subsistence agricultural economy. All that has changed. There's been a labor migration out of FATA, and that has really drastically changed, not just abroad to the Gulf, but also to Karachi and other cities of Pakistan. That has created new elite nodes there, how that ties up into this discussion of structure. And to Peter, I completely agree with your view on the drones, but just a little bit more engagement I would like from you on the issue about the civilian versus militants killed, and that reaction that those strikes create in the perception, in the public perception of that. I think there's a nuance missing here, because when we saw the signature and force protection strikes, which were just striking not just high-value targets, striking just a number of collection of militants, that in itself creates, when you hit a group of about 30 or 40 militants and you kill them, that itself creates a greater trauma in the society there, which creates a greater kind of fallout in the adjoining areas, which translates into greater opposition and greater reaction. So I think it's kind of, we have to discuss it a little more. It doesn't really matter if no civilians are killed. If you have a huge number of people killed in strikes, it just ends up having a greater trauma. Thanks.
Akbar?
Symbol, the Pashtuns are very wise people, and they have great literature. One of the proverbs says that the mountains were eaten up by nung, or honor. So we destroyed ourselves because of honor. And the plains were eaten up by kalang, which is taxes, revenues. This is a very famous old Pashto saying. The tribal areas, as parts of Balochistan, were impoverished, remain impoverished, and therefore this labor migration that you talk about actually began. You remember the phrase, Dubai Chalo. This was back in the 70s and 80s. Hundreds of thousands of these labor went there. They were tough, they were hardworking, they sent remittances back. Now, they've run into, directly after 9/11, a lot is tied up with 9/11, this very aggressive and enthusiastic attempt to track the movement of finance involving Muslims. So that's hit them very hard. In terms of Karachi, Karachi has always been the largest Pashtun city in the world. They've always been in Karachi. And now there's evidence that a lot of them are very much inclined to think along the lines of the Taliban and are asserting themselves, which is going to be more clashes. The clash is already taking place. More clashes, more ethnic violence. And again, I, as an administrator, would be very unhappy with that.
Yeah, I agree. I think the signature strikes were not wise. One thing that we haven't talked about is sort of the opposite part of this discussion, which is the Pakistan Army operation. I think in South Waziristan, Amnesty International had a report about the number of civilian casualties. I can't remember the numbers exactly, but there was at least 1,000 civilian casualties. An F-16 strike by the Pakistani Air Force clearly is not a particularly precise kind of strike. And Bayatullah Masood was not only responsible for the death of Benazir Bhutto, which he ordered, but also for the deaths of, taking even the most conservative estimate, hundreds or perhaps even thousands of Pakistanis. If you accept the idea that something like 30,000 or 40,000 Pakistani civilians have died in violence caused by insurgent groups like the Taliban, the leader of the Pakistani Taliban, Bayatullah Masood, is ultimately responsible for the deaths of tens of thousands of Pakistani civilians. And And I think that that was kind of well understood in Pakistan when he was killed. There was no great mourning of the death of Bayatullah Masood. In fact, I remember I was in Pakistan the day it happened. Dawn had a huge headline, you know, "Kill Bayatullah, good riddance." And so these drone strikes are sometimes, but not always, done very much in Pakistan's interests. And so that's another dimension of this. And we live in a world of difficult choices. And often the choice we have to make is a least bad choice. And sometimes I think a least bad choice is a drone strike. So the idea that drones are sort of inherently bad, which I think is something that we might talk ourselves into, I think is wrong. And in fact, you can make a moral case for drone warfare, which you don't hear very often, which is that, of course, they're much more discriminatory. There are good things and bad things about that. In a sense, they make their use a lot easier because they're much more discriminatory. And of course, no other lives are at risk on the other side. So I would like to throw those ideas into the mix here. And one other thing I'd like to throw into the mix is the idea that somehow by leaving the tribal regions alone, that we'd have the problem would be over. Unfortunately, this is exactly what the Pakistani government did with peace agreements in 2005 and 2006 in South Waziristan, and peace agreements with the Taliban in Swat in 2009. These peace agreements allowed the Taliban to regroup. The Taliban didn't observe any element of the peace agreement, and they expanded their influence and territory. And it's not, and go back to the opinion poll we did in Fatah, there is no great admiration for the Taliban in Fatah at all. In fact, we had, one of our questions was, if the Taliban was, if you could vote for the Taliban, you know, would you vote for them? And less than 1% said that they would. There was a great deal of hostility to the Pakistan Taliban, not surprising. There's nothing like living under Taliban rule for you to have a healthy skepticism about their claims to bring utopia here on earth. And there was a slightly higher favorable view of the Afghan Taliban. So in all this discussion, we're looking at some pretty tough and difficult choices. And in fact, the United States government did try and put money into the tribal regions. It didn't really work for all sorts of reasons that aren't necessarily the subject of this discussion. So that is all to say that there are a lot of really bad options here, and we have to think about which ones are the least bad, rather than sort of some ideal world where we just wave a magic wand over the place and everybody is happy.
To sort of
You got it.
continue with the point about the tribal structures, I mean, with respect to the work that we have looked at in Afghanistan, we have noticed major demographic shifts, largely to areas of security, areas where stability and the rule of law take place, and primarily this explains the broad expansion of places like Kabul. One of the other things that, while the ambassador has alluded to, that needs to be emphasized in these traditional structures and in customary law is the deep denigration of the rights of women. One of the focuses of this examination was to look at how tribal structures interact with religious law. And in that context, we found that customary practices were often contrary to Islamic law. And for example, the rights of inheritance, women's ability to obtain marriages and whatnot. And our studies, which are also have looked and examined the trends on the ground, have noticed that in more heterogeneous populations, where there is a matrix of different tribal interactions, there needs to be a mediating legal role, and that mediating legal role tends to be areas of Islamic law, areas of commonality, whereby the intersection of one's identity stops at the water's edge of, say, being a Pashtun and looks at, for example, being an Uzbek, a Tajik, and a Pashtun and using Islamic law. On the other hand, in those areas where one singular homogeneous population which predominates can actually cause a stranglehold on the religious identity. And there are numerous challenges, either by the central government or by others, to then create a mechanism or at least a mediating role whereby you can go to a least common denominator that doesn't necessarily have to harm the rights of individuals. So it's important to emphasize that in as much as you would like to take a hands-off approach, these demographic shifts have actually pervaded and allowed populations to interact and actually prevented them from being overly oppressive. especially with respect to a matrix of identities. So to the extent that you talk about tribal identity and shifts in population, sometimes that can be a good thing when it comes down to the individual.
I'd like to be able to get at least two more questions here, so, yeah.
All right, Marvin, I'm Steve Engelken. I just retired from the Foreign Service. My last job before retirement last summer was acting consul general in Peshawar. I have one quick comment. I don't think we can really discuss drones very well until both Pakistani government and the U.S. government allow people to talk about it, because there's a lot of details that people don't know, and you can't use it, you can't defend it, or because I can't say it. The other thing I wanted to ask, though, is about the provincial election. We're having a national election, but there will also be a provincial election coming up. And I was wondering, as most would know, Khyber Pakhtunkhwa has been governed by the Awami National Party for the last several years. It's a secular nationalist party. It's been repeatedly attacked by the Pakistani Taliban. What impact do we expect from the provincial election on the situation in Fatah and on the Taliban, who have been so opposed to the ANP? Thank you.
Who'd like to try that?
Steve, you need to point out, and no doubt you are aware, being recently back from Peshawar, that the tribal areas of Pakistan, technically attached to the province, in fact are federally administered. And there's a debate about their future. A lot of people in the province would say that these should join the province and therefore become part of the provincial government. Some people are arguing that they should have their own province. And some are saying they should continue as attached directly to the federal government. The last option gives them maximum autonomy, which is what they would want, with all the desire for progress and so on. You need to also, Steve, be conscious that we're talking about the Pashtuns, this particular ethnic group. That is the same Pashtuns who have produced young girls like Malala Yousafzai, who are determined to acquire education. That in Peshawar, where you're coming from, you have figures like the Reverend Titus Pressler heading Edwards College, American. You have Foreman Christian College in Lahore, American, Presbyterian. The most popular one of the most popular in Pakistan. So you also have very vigorous, positive initiatives helped by the Americans in winning over Pakistanis and helping Pakistanis with one thing that all of them are united on, which is education. And that, I think, is a very strong counter to the drone, which ends up by creating controversy and hatred and anger. Education ends up by creating friends, alliances, and people saying, we want to know more about this America. Would you agree with that, Steve?
Almost, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, education was a big plank of the ANP. I think they announced the creation of several universities and expansion of the educational system.
Yes.
One hopes that
Yeah. Stephen, if the JUI prevails, as they did in 2003, based on their track record, I think we will see quite a difference. These parties have been very much on the opposite side when it comes to the Pakistan Taliban. Yes.
My name is Arnold Zeitlin, and I had the pleasure of founding the first Associated Press Bureau in Pakistan 40 years ago when Akbar and I became friends. The question I want to ask, is there any evidence, are there of an informed leadership that would be willing and able to establish a structure in Fatah or anywhere else in Pakistan for that matter?
The kind of structure I'm talking about? What kind of structure, Arnold?
No. Is there any leadership there that would, you have mentioned the structure, but I don't hear anything specific.
You know, I'm in touch with several people from that part of the world, and what struck me from the tribal areas, locals, Wazir, Masood, and so on, what struck me was how much they emphasize this point. To them, it's an article of faith. It's the first step. You know, it's a long, complicated, difficult way ahead, but without this, nothing will work. And I would refer you to Khalid Aziz, who was not only political agent in North Waziristan, but was chief secretary of the province and heads a think tank. And he does, like Peter, lots of surveys. By the way, confirming what Peter was saying, that in fact, the people of the tribal areas have the same kind of attitude to the Americans as they do to the TTP. Both are equally unpopular in about the same
The popularity
statistic.
of Americans really doesn't make any difference.
But Ani, that was the good news.
The popularity of Americans in Pakistan is based probably on the lines in front of the consulate and the embassy of Pakistan.
Who want visas from Steve?
That's more important than
So
surveys.
the question is this, Ani, that there are people who are thinking along these lines, including Khalid Aziz, and he has various studies on this. His problem is the same. He points this out. He says, my job is really to educate Pakistani leaders, where there's a similar reluctance to understand the very different nature of society across the borders, the Indus in Balochistan and the tribal areas. So it is a challenge just to bring this information to the future leaders of Pakistan.
We'll take one more question, okay.
Ask it. Dr. Gaya with USAID. My question is for Peter Bergen. As we see the U.S. draw down in Afghanistan, wouldn't we imagine that the reliance on drone strikes would increase, given that there might not be the anvil on the Afghan side because of the non-existence of U.S. or the smaller existence of U.S. troops there? And then, as you mentioned, as the Pakistani civilian government starts taking more ownership away from the Pakistani army, hopefully, and that resistance to drone strikes increase, how is that conflict going to be managed?
Actually, I would say the reverse. If you look at the increase in the drone strikes, it tracks pretty well with the rise in the number of American troops in Afghanistan. In fact, it tracks almost exactly. So as the American troop presence draws down, the strikes have also gone down. Correlation is not necessarily causation, but I just wanted to point that out. So it's quite possible that the continuing downward drift in the number of drone strikes may continue. And in fact, you know, one of the other factors here is the targets. There may be fewer and fewer targets. This has been going on since the summer of 2008. So you must be, if you're still in the tribal regions and you're a leader of a militant group, you must be either pretty desperate or not very intelligent to be continuing to stay there. So I would anticipate that this continuing, the number of strikes would continue to go down. And I didn't really understand your second question, but we've run out of time, so it doesn't matter.
Well, yes, we have run out of time, and I want to thank our panelists here, and particularly Akbar Ahmed, for sharing with us his in-depth thinking about this part of the world, and although, as I say, this part because he has extended his scholarship well beyond the AFPAC area. And Peter and Ahmed, thank you for joining us. And on behalf of USIP, thank you for coming.
Thanks, sir.